Thank you. The Honorable Dr. Otiende Amollo, member for Rarieda.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, before I start, could I get your directions?
Senior Counsel, if you can just give me a minute. Those who are interested in contributing to this motion, please go to the intervention. Press the intervention button.
May I get your direction, Madam Speaker? Being the only dissenting voice out of a committee of 30, and now that the mover, the seconder, and the seconder have taken 45 minutes, could I get your direction in terms of consideration, how much time you could give me?
Honorable Dr. Otiende Amollo, you will have 10 minutes.
Very well. I will prosecute.
So please make use of your 10 minutes to say everything
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I want to thank you and I want to thank the committee. It is true we had 5 issues, 3 of which we had convergence, and I will not speak about them. We converged and agreed on the question of the National Security Advisor. We agreed on the issue of removal of the public seal from the Attorney General, and we agreed on the expansion of the Assumption of Office Committee. My divergence is on 2 others. First, the question of the Chief Administrative Secretary, and secondly, the question of the Head of Public Service. Madam Speaker, the history of this country is clear if you look at the Bomas report and you look at the exit report of the Committee of Experts, that the people of this country wanted a limited executive, limited in 2 respects. 1, in terms of powers, and that the Constitution has endeavored to do. 2, in terms of numbers. In those numbers, they did 2 things. They removed the office of assistant ministers. And for the ones of ministers and PSS, especially ministers, they limited them to between 14 and 23, for good reason. To introduce the office of Chief Administrative Secretary is to introduce the office of assistant minister by a different baptismal name. And so, we are seeking to defeat the will of Kenyans as a house, and that is unacceptable. Secondly, Madam Speaker, it amounts to sabotaging the very desire of Kenyans that they expressed over 20 years and including in a referendum. And if you are reconsidering the structures, whether of parliament or whether of the executive, you should not bring it just to this house. You should wait and put it in an amendment to the Constitution so that the people can tell you whether they still want a limited executive or not. And that is not the case here. We are now limiting it by legislation. Madam Speaker, the other problem with this introduction is if you look carefully at the role of the cabinet secretaries and you look carefully at the role of the principal secretaries, there is no new role that is being given to the Chief Administrative Secretary. None at all. None that is not undertaken by those 2 offices. So we are actually creating a duplication of roles with the dangers of giving some roles by legislation to people who have constitutional roles. And that I have a big problem with. There is nothing new. Madam Speaker, more importantly also, and this is why Kenyans did not want this bloated government, the cost of maintaining public service, be it judiciary, be it the legislature, be it the executive, is far too high that if Kenyans had their way, they would reduce even the size of this house. But instead of working on ways of reduction, we are working towards increment. And not just increment, even of a defined number of 23, increment, as Honorable Murugara said, to an undefined number that the president can, at his whim, decide. At a time that the cost of living is as high as it is, on a day that the medical personnel in this country have gone on strike because interns cannot be hired. The cost of hiring one intern is 42,370 basic. The cost of hiring one chief administrative secretary, going by the last batch, out a basic salary of 800,000 and the benefits, and it comes to 2 million. Madam Speaker, one chief administrative secretary is equivalent to hiring 47 interns. If then you get to 50, as was prescribed last time, you'd be talking of 2,350 interns. And if it gets to 100, as now the committee is recommending, you multiply by that. So we don't have money to pay interns, but we have money to create offices and pay. I have a big problem with that. Madam Speaker, more importantly, and lastly on this point, the creation of this office was declared unconstitutional and remains unconstitutional. And it was not for want of legislation. Madam Speaker, there are two cases that speaks to this very clearly. There's case number, first, there's the High Court, case number 38 and 42 of 2018, in which Justice Mrima clearly declares in his judgment, and that's at paragraph 310 sub B, that the court declares the office of the Chief Administrative Secretary is unconstitutional. And this is not about numbers, this is not about legislation, this is on the reading of the Constitution. The second case, Madam Speaker, is case number E084 and E0150 of 2025. Three judges, Justice Ongudi, Justice Kimondo, and Justice Visram. In this decision, the majority, again, in paragraph 301, declares the office of Chief Administrative Secretary unconstitutional, with one dissent. The dissent is by Justice Ongudi. And how does she dissent? She dissents by saying, and that's paragraph 38 of her dissent, that she finds that the creation of the office 50 of an additional 27 posts is unconstitutional. On the contrary, the establishment of the office with 23 posts is constitutional. Now, we are going even further than the dissent. We are not only doing 23 so that you even find a way of fitting Justice Ongudi's decisions, but we are going to even beyond 50. Now, if it was unconstitutional then, it is worse now. Madam Speaker, the head of public service, this has a long history. If you look at the report of the Committee of Experts, the Bomas report, we started from the very powerful Chief Secretary office. And before 2010, people knew who the Chief Secretary was, even if they didn't know the ministers, because it was very powerful. It was found necessary to divorce that office, which comes with the presidency, from the normal public service. So what was done? It was determined that the routine public officers should be headed by a commission, the Public Service Commission, because these are permanent employees who need not play politics. On the other hand, there are those who come with the elected president, with the executive, which is not permanent and is transitional. And in that office, that is why we put the secretary to the cabinet, so that the head of the public service is divorced from the transitional office of the president. And that's why the Constitution has the secretary to the cabinet with very clear defined roles. What reintroducing the head of public service here does, it conflates those two offices suddenly again. It removes the permanent control of public servants from the Public Service Commission and purports to put it under the very transitional clause of the head of public service. And in doing so, it does not address the role of the secretary to the cabinet, because all those roles that are now described here are supposed to be roles of the secretary to the cabinet. Madam Speaker, in removing that, it then now removes a commission to an individual, but does something much worse. It removes the very clear boundaries that were put before that. It is possible, as the chair says, that the committee has attempted to define it within the executive. But then it still remains head of public service. And then it means he will be heading the public servants, the permanent public servants within the office of the president. But lastly, Madam Speaker, as the chair administration has said, there was a court case which challenged that office. And the court stated that there's nothing wrong with the president having a head of public service. The president has had a head of public service without legislation. So why are we creating legislation? Why are we creating a problem where there's none? Madam Speaker, I am opposed to the bits on the head of public service and the chief administrator.
The Honorable